Killingsworth. I am the director of the Woodrow Wilson Center's Canada Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you here this morning to the 8th Woodrow Wilson Center Cross-Border Forum on Energy Issues, Understanding Linkages Between Energy, the Environment, and the Economy. I'd also like to join with our partners, the Canadian Centre for Energy Information, Global Public Affairs, and the Canadian Consulate General in San Francisco to welcome you here this morning. In particular, though, I'd like to thank Chevron for its gracious support of today's program, and San Francisco State University's Institute for Next Generation Internet for letting us use their space for the event today. For those of you unfamiliar with the center, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars is the living national memorial to the 28th President, established by the United States Congress in 1968 within the Smithsonian Institution. It's a nonpartisan institution supported by public and private funds engaged in the study of national and world affairs. The center establishes and maintains a neutral forum for free, open, and informed dialogue. It does not have a research or legislative agenda. The Canada Institute seeks to promote policy debate and analysis of key issues of bilateral concern between Canada and the United States, highlight the importance of the U.S.-Canada relationship, both in the United States and in Canada, increase knowledge about Canada among U.S. policymakers, create new channels of communication among scholars, business leaders, public officials, and non-governmental representatives in Canada and the United States, generate discussion about future visions for North American integration, and share relevant programming and publications with appropriate partners in Canada to encourage a dialogue on these issues among a Canadian audience. Our first cross-border forum on energy issues dealt with the broad business relationship between Canada and the United States, with a particular focus on the energy sector. One of the most noteworthy outcomes was the recognition of the need for further dialogue. Through our subsequent energy forums on the natural gas supply in North America, oil sands, the North American electricity system, and our last program held in March of this year in Washington on innovation, science, and technology in the industry, we found that these forums serve to foster and sustain an ongoing dialogue between stakeholders in each country's energy sector. These stakeholders include not only the members of the energy sector and government agencies, but also from not-for-profit organizations, the financial investment communities, and related businesses. The Canada Institute has hosted programs on the climate change issue, the first last May, which looked at the climate change politics in North America, specifically at the role of states, provinces, and regions in tackling the issues. I know that some of you participated in that program. This past spring, working with the Public Policy Forum in Ottawa, we gathered another group of experts in Washington from both sides of the border, one to inform Canadians of the political levers in the United States, and to encourage U.S. policymakers to include Canada in plans for a carbon-constrained North America. I'll now turn the podium over to my colleague, Colleen Killingsworth, President of the Canadian Centre for Energy Information, who will give a little more background on today's program, as well as some housekeeping information. Thanks for joining us. We look forward to hearing your voice, your opinions on today's topic in this closed-door session later. Colleen.
Thanks, David. Thank you, David. And I'd also like to welcome you here this morning and thank Chevron for their generous support to today's program. It's through the generous support of our sponsors that we've been able to sustain these cross-border dialogues, which I think are very important. For those of you unfamiliar with the Canadian Centre for Energy Information, we're a non-profit, non-advocacy, third-party energy information resource on Canadian energy and energy-related issues. The Centre for Energy operates as a public-private partnership and is meeting the urgent need for comprehensive, relevant, and unbiased information delivered both online and in print formats. We cover the whole spectrum of energy, from hydroelectric power, natural gas, crude oil, coal, nuclear, solar, wind, geothermal generation, and other sources of energy, to energy transmission and distribution systems, energy efficiency, consumer tips and information, and much more. In fact, you'll find some of our print publications in your participant kit today. We believe an informed and educated public better understands and supports regulatory and policy choices, makes better business decisions related to energy, chooses careers in energy, invests in energy, and even uses energy more wisely. Like the Canada Institute, the Canadian Centre for Energy Information supports a collaborative learning and outreach approach on energy-related issues among North American audiences. We believe these cross-border energy forums have been successful in building and creating the constructive dialogue that is critical to the sustainability of our integrated North American energy systems. I'm confident that today's session will be no different given the caliber of our panelists and our participants. As a lead-up to today's forum, we participated in a recent poll of just over 1,000 Canadians and 1,000 Americans conducted by SES Research out of Ottawa in conjunction with the University of Buffalo. We wanted to test the level of support for mandatory emissions reduction measures if it means an increase in the price of energy. Intensity of support of mandatory emissions reductions is lower in the U.S. compared to Canada due to the price impact. The survey also noted that both Americans and Canadians agree on the importance of an integrated energy policy. You'll find those data sheets in your participant kit as well. I think this is an important signal as we work to address the challenging questions we have posed to ourselves today. How do we develop the natural resources we have and require within the policy constraints we are setting for ourselves? How do we balance the trade-offs between energy security, economic efficiency, and the environment with the reality that we are a fossil fuel-based economy and will be for decades to come? Are we relying on the technology of the future to take care of what we are deciding today? And how do we as consumers of energy learn to live with the consequences of our decisions? Before introducing our moderator, I would like to remind everyone of the formats for today's discussion. We will begin with the remarks from our moderator and our panelists, who will start to address these questions from their perspectives. This portion of the forum will be videotaped, as you see, and archived on the Centre for Energy and the Canada Institute's websites. We will then turn off the video camera, take a 15-20-minute break, which again will be next door where breakfast was, and come back for a closed door, not for attribution, Chatham House rules dialogue and discussion. This will be your opportunity to respond to and challenge what you've heard from our panelists. And again, the camera will be off. I would now like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Jane C. Long, but before doing it, I see I have one more housekeeping note here. The restrooms are just past the elevator, if anybody is looking for them. So now, Dr. Long, sorry about that. Okay. Dr. Long is the Associate Director at Large at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, working on energy and the environment. She served as the Dean at Mackey School of Mines, University of Nevada, Reno, my alma mater, I just had to mention that, from 1979 to 2003. And while there, she initiated the Mining Life Cycle Center and the Great Basin Center for Geothermal Research. Previously, Long was on the staff at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory for 20 years. She is an expert in rock mechanics and fracture hydrology and has worked on several U.S. and international underground nuclear waste repository research projects. Her research investigates fluid flow and fractures with applications in nuclear waste storage, geothermal reservoirs, petroleum reservoirs, and containment transport. She was the chair for the National Research Council study, Rock Fractures and Fluid Flow, Contemporary Understanding and Applications, and was a member of the Board of Radioactive Waste Management. She received a Bachelor in Science and Engineering from Brown University and a Master in Science and Geotechnical Engineering and a PhD in Material Science and Mineral Engineering from the University of California, Berkeley. She is a member of several academic advisory boards and an associate of the National Academy of Sciences. Dr. Long, it is now my pleasure to turn the forum over to you. Thanks,
Colleen. I'm glad to see I made it past the restrooms. This morning I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the triad of interests that control what we do about energy, and that triad being interests in economics, security, and climate or environment. This triad really seems to be in great play right now with all of the issues associated with each of the vertices of this triangle. becoming more urgent. From an economic perspective, we're beginning to look at $100 a barrel oil, something we're all dreading and looking at as with a thought to what it'll do for the affluence that we've become used to that's been derived from oil for our two countries. And as well, we look at what's happening in Venezuela or what's happening in the Straits of Hormuz and look at the security issues and the geopolitics of oil and how... Is that better? How do I turn it off?
That should be fine.
Okay, so I should just talk louder?
Yeah.
Okay, so the security issues, the geopolitical issues having to do with the nationalization of a lot of oil, the geopolitics of supporting countries that have bad behavior in terms of human rights because of the need for oil and all of the conflict that results as a result of that. I can turn it back on. Okay. But increasingly, the environment, the climate, but as well inextricably linked to issues of the ocean, water, agriculture, ecosystems, ecosystem health, all of these environmental issues also being connected to energy. So what's happening here is that all of the constituencies, these three constituencies, agree we have a problem. We have an energy problem. And the problem is now trying to decide what we're going to do about it. And this has really become a powerful dialogue now. You know, 2 years ago, you wouldn't hear very much more than an article or two a week. Now there is, if you open the New York Times, there's never a day, or the Wall Street Journal, there's never a day when there isn't an article about this, if not 10 articles. So the dialogue about what to do is really becoming important. And I'd just like to bring up 4 key points or principles that I think might be part of this issue. The first one is that people will agree about what to do, but they won't agree about why. And that understanding that from the beginning means that you're beginning to look for common ground where the constituencies are each getting something out of it that they want, but they're not necessarily agreeing on the reason why they might be doing what they're doing. I think some good examples are energy efficiency, where everyone sees this as in their best interest. You know, energy security, they want to limit energy imports. Well, if you use less, you have less imports. People that are worried about economics see that the cost would go down if the demand goes down. So, and people who are worried about climate see a lower emission. So they find a common ground. And you see this in renewable energy as well. And it's why in the United States, in particular, the success of renewable portfolio standards is so evident in many, many states. It's over half the states have renewable portfolio standards, and we're considering a national standard. I think that is because people who see economic development from developing these new companies, people see energy security from not having to import energy because we're doing it domestically, and the climate constituency sees that they're not going to have emissions from these sources. So that common ground is there. And I think the big question for us is, what can technology do now to expand that common ground? What kinds of new toys can we put on the table that increasingly pull these three constituencies together? And that can make a huge difference. So the second principle I'd like to bring up is, when I mentioned before, is that there is a clear and present shift in the triangle towards the climate issues and what effect they're having on our energy system and what we're going to do about it. You know, in years past, we really had most of the tension between energy security and economics. And so Schlesinger had a famous quote, which was, U.S. has two ways of dealing with energy. One is complacency, and the other is panic. And I think that the age of that is got to end, because the climate problem is a persistent, long-term problem that's going to require a concerted effort that's going to be slow and inexorable and resulting in massive change to the way we live. And that means a very different attitude towards energy than oscillating between panic and complacency. These things are going to move and continue and continue, and the pressure will continue and continue and continue. That's very different. So as long as carbon becomes the clarifying issue in this energy triad, the economists are looking towards market solutions, and they believe, as economists do, that if you get the externality pricing right, that it'll solve all these problems and minimize the cost of achieving your goal. But the question will come up, is this really the best way to encourage that technology change, that technology shift, which is going to increase this a zone of agreement? So, and at the same time, I think environmentalists who are looking at the climate problem are seeing the importance of the economic issue, because as we look at where the problem lies, so much of it lies in China and India and in the developing world, and they are not going to do anything about this climate problem until they've done something about their affluence problem. So the economic development of that side is very, very important. Increasingly, we're seeing the environmentalists reach out to the security contingent, and to the economic contingent with analysis. We've seen the Stern report come by with actually analyzing the present value of inaction, or the cost of inaction in the future. And I think that these reports are very controversial, what their assumptions are in the economic analysis. For example, Stern used a near zero discount rate, which is very controversial among economists, and the environmentalists say, well, that really is just an economic analysis way of treating this as an ethical problem, which is what it really is, and this dialogue is continuing. But I think more importantly, what I'm beginning to see now is more literature coming out which doesn't look at the expected value, doesn't look at the probable outcome of climate change. It looks at the extreme values, because the distribution of what's going to happen with climate change is a fat tail distribution. In other words, there are low probability events which are not zero. They're not near zero. They're small but significant, and the impacts of higher climate sensitivity, if that should occur, is enormous. So in classic risk analysis, you multiply the probability of the event times the impact of the event. The impact is enormous, and the probability is still significant. These are not normal distributions, and that heavy tail analysis, or looking at the less probable but still significantly possible events on climate, are beginning to turn around as be the basis of analysis that the environmentalists are using to reach out to the economic community. What I think is really important right now is what will the fossil fuel companies do in terms of preparing for this future. How will they prepare for the low carbon future? And how will they structure themselves to be making money in this low carbon future? And another question that comes up is, how will the security contingent take on the idea that climate is a security problem? There is expected to be over 50 million refugees, environmental refugees, due to climate change just in the next 10 to 20 years. And we don't know, for example, very much about how fast sea level will rise. Things are happening much faster than climate scientists thought they would. And if we get a 6-meter rise in sea level, that will affect something like 40% of the population of the Earth. So I think this is something that's very serious, and the question is whether the military-industrial complex will become the military-climate-industrial complex. See, the third thing I'd like to bring up, and I'll just be very brief about it, is that the rate of change, the rate of and magnitude of the changes that we're seeing now is going to be very, very large, and much larger than our institutions are capable of dealing with. And so the building of institutional capacity to be able to handle what we're seeing happening is really important. And I think this is going to include getting people like Art Rosenfeld, those of you who know him in California, to serve in government, people who are very knowledgeable and sensible, to be in a policymaking position. There's a huge role for academics here. We haven't trained people in energy for 30 years. We need to build that capacity. These people need to get out and solve those problems. We need conveners, and we need people with vision and leadership. And that leads me to my last point, and probably the most important point. In all of this, I think the issue is that we face these really rather significant problems. But what we really need now is a vision of what the future is, a vision that people can go towards, because people do a lot better going towards things than they do being afraid. And Ted Nordhaus and Michael Schellenberger just published a book. I heard them talk the other night, and they give a great analogy of what is meant by a vision. They talk about Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, which evidently started out as "I have a nightmare" speech. And he was very, very angry with Kennedy for Kennedy asking him not to have the March on Washington. And he stood up on the mall in front of all those people, and he started to talk about how the Negro people had been taken advantage of, and how the country was, had gone to the bank, and the bank was empty, and, it was all negative. And Mahalia Jackson was in the background, and she just kept shouting out at him, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream, Martin." And he just stopped, and he sat down and he gave the "I Have a Dream" speech, which he had given in pieces before, but he did it on the spot. And that galvanized the civil rights movement and gave people a place to aim for. And I think right now in our energy future and what that means for society and what that means for the way we live, we need an "I Have a Dream" speech. We need an "I Have a Dream." Right now, it is the case that people think, many, many people in this country think they're happy if they have a car that goes 0 to 60 in 30 seconds. Maybe they should be happy if they're driving a 230 mile per gallon Apted, I believe it's called, Apted car, sells for $26,000 and runs on as a hybrid diesel and runs on 3 wheels. And they can be great because they've got this high-tech, wonderful, energy-efficient car. What is it going to take for us to live well in cities in a low-energy profile and not drive everywhere and have energy-efficient buildings and have all the things we're going to need to have a good life, but not use the amount of energy that we've been using and not produce the amount of emissions we've been using? That vision is really probably the most important thing. So today, we're now going to hear from 4 of our speakers. First speaker will be Rhonda Zygocki from Chevron Corporation, and then Dan Skopek from who's going to talk about a California perspective. Joseph Doucette from the University of Alberta, and he's going to give an academic perspective. And then from the Canadian federal government perspective, Christy Varango. And I think the bios are all in your package, so I won't repeat them and won't take any more time talking about it. Rhonda.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Anne. That was a great opening, and I don't think I'm going to follow up with "I Have a Dream," but we certainly have a view, and we're certainly pleased to be able to share that view with you today as an energy company really actively participating in this debate. Let me start off by saying Chevron's ties to Canada go back to 1938. Our ties to California go back to 1877. Both of these ties remain strong today. Our production operations in this range between the two, from San Joaquin Valley in California. Is it not on? Oh, yeah, I'm a little short. Oh, yeah, wonderful. This is awesome. From San Joaquin Valley here in California to the oil sands of Athabasca to offshore production in Newfoundland and refining and marketing activities through Western Canada and California. Beyond my corporate interest in Canada, I have a personal interest. California is my current home. Canada is my country, and it's so nice to share this important dialogue with fellow Canadians and Californians today. I look forward to this event with that special interest. Let's talk about our position on energy. In 2004, Chevron conveyed a view that the world was entering a new energy equation, and that was driven by 4 things: convergence of geological difficulty, geopolitical instability, increased demand, and constrained supply. And that was a message we put out about 3 years ago. And as we sit here today, and as Anne conveyed, 3 years later, the current realities and further analysis truly does affirm that view. The world's population is growing, so is its economy. We're in one of the longest sustained economic expansions in history, and growing economies, especially India and China, as we know, are driving up the demand for energy and actually reshaping the marketplace. In fact, according to the National Petroleum Council, who just finished an extensive assessment, the world is expected to use up to 60% more energy by 2030 than it does today. To give you an idea of the scale of investments that are going to be required to meet such demand, the International Energy Agency has just put out a new estimate that those investments need to produce, deliver, process, and transport those energies, including oil, gas, coal, and other resources, will approach $22 trillion. And that's an increase of about $2 trillion from their previous estimate. So costs are going up, and energy demand is not coming off of the estimates we've been looking at over the last few years. The findings of the MPC study are very sobering. Even the study's title reveals it, saying, "Facing the Hard Truths About Energy." Among the hard truths, we are facing accumulating risks in meeting the growing demand. Among these risks are rising resource nationalism, higher development costs, challenging new resource areas such as ultra-deep water and the Arctic, and the need to manage carbon emissions, again, as my colleagues have already stated. Simply put, in our view, the era of easy access to energy is over. Among the study's suggested responses to this, because we understand the challenges, but as we say, it is now about solutions, practical solutions. The responses were becoming more energy efficient. Truly, the cheapest, easiest, and cleanest source of new energy is efficiency and conservation. And they went on to say, to finding new supplies of energy, expanding production of oil and gas in the U.S., as well as diversifying our supplies with clean coal, nuclear, biomass, and other renewables. To put it another way, we will need every molecule of energy we can find in every potential form to meet this future demand. We are entering an and world of energy, not an or world. In other words, it's not gasoline or biofuels, it's gasoline and biofuels. And it is markedly an interdependent energy world, not an independent world. So how do we provide that energy? We know what the issues are. That's one of today's greatest challenges. First, we must recognize the fundamental truth that I think Colleen mentioned in her opening remarks. Oil, natural gas, coal, and nuclear will be indispensable to meeting our energy needs for decades to come. Renewables, widely seen as a promising way to lower dependence on hydrocarbons and potentially reduce carbon emissions, will also contribute. And investment must be made. Between 2002 and 2006, our company, Chevron, spent $52 billion to bring new energy supplies, oil, natural gas, as well as renewables and alternatives to our customers. And this year, we spend another $20 billion more. Over the next 25 years, all energy sources will grow, but the mix is expected to stay constant. In fact, the U.S. Energy Information Administration forecasts that in the next 25 years, oil, coal, and natural gas are expected to provide roughly 85% of the world's energy mix, which is close to today's mix. Biofuels in that time frame are expected to grow 600% and still only supply 1% of that total energy. Biofuels are certainly important to the future of transportation. We support their development and are extensively active in the R&D and policy making in these areas, but they have practical limitations which are sometimes overlooked. One of these involves scale. The country's largest biodiesel facility today in Washington State, one of them, has an annual production capacity of 100 million gallons. That sounds like a lot. That would serve the country's demand for 6 hours of one day. It's about the same amount of transportation fuel our Pascagoula refinery in Mississippi produces in 1 week. It will take 52 of those biodiesel facilities to replace one large refinery. That's not to say we shouldn't proceed, and we should, but scale takes time, and that's a reality we're dealing with as we enter this domain. Corn-based ethanol, for example, may become an important short-term alternative, but it's no silver bullet. And we all know the debate that's happening around corn-based ethanol, especially given rising concerns about water usage and food versus fuel use of the crop. To get this energy future right, these limitations must be thoughtfully understood, both in terms of technical, in terms of physical usage of infrastructure, and in terms of policy. The great opportunity and also the great challenge in biofuels is, of course, to convert non-food sources like wood pulp, switchgrass, into cellulosic ethanol. We are making significant investments in the race to develop these second-generation fuels and energy alternatives. We are among the world's largest geothermal producers and plan to spend about $2.5 billion in the next 3 years on renewables, energy efficiency, and other alternatives. We have research partnerships with a number of academic institutions, including UC Davis here in the state, and with federal government to pursue biofuels technologies and to participate in demonstration to understand their practical limitations. We're also working with Weyerhaeuser, another California company, Forest Products, to commercialize biofuels from wood fiber, switchgrass, and rice straw and waste products used in their pulp and paper operations. We are optimistic. Despite these limitations and the realities of scale, we are optimistic about the long-term potential of biofuels and other alternatives. But the scale will require a great deal of work, investment, and time. The typical timeline for large unconventional energy development to reach commercial scale is 10+ years. And it's an important factor as we look at policies that set mandates and goals within the time frame of infrastructure and technology development. As it is next generation technology we're speaking of, it's important that the policies encourage their development and recognize these realities. These tough realities that define the global energy landscape, interestingly enough, are also present here in California. Did you know that California was the largest gasoline market by volume in the world after the U.S. itself? Did you know that it's in the last 100 years, the state has gone from supplying 25% of the world's oil production to importing 60% of its own needs. And that's a transition over century that the state has gone through. Or that California has become a net importer of natural gas, with almost 90% of California's natural gas coming from Canada and other states. And in this landscape, the state's population is expected to grow from 36 million to some 45 by 2025. And all of these people will need energy. If unaddressed, as Anne pointed out, the decreasing domestic energy production, rising imports will pose energy and economic security risks for this state. California has long shaped its own destiny on these matters. But as it gets closer to the end of the energy pipeline, the more its destiny will be determined by others. Clearly, there's never been a greater need to look at the situation, I think, both from a visionary point of view, but we would say also realistically. At Chevron, we think solutions can be found, and we are not only engaged in finding them, we are actually encouraging others to join us. We agree with the MPC's emphasis on one solution we can all be a part of, and that is energy efficiency, to use energy resources more wisely. Based on the International Energy Agency data, a 20% improvement in U.S. energy efficiency could save the equivalent of 9 million barrels a day of oil across all energy sources. That could prove important, since the DOE projects that by 2030, we're going to need 30% more energy, which is equivalent to about 14 million more barrels of oil. As an acknowledged leader in energy efficiency, California is leading the way for such improvements. We also emphasize energy efficiency as a company, and since 1992, we've increased our operational energy efficiency by 27%. We know it can be done, and we know there's more potential out there. And we also know that of all of the solutions, this one crosses the domains of energy, the economy, and the environment. And it is a policy solution that must be the bedrock of any energy and climate policy that is being contemplated at the state and federal level. But efficiency alone won't meet this challenge. It won't meet the state's energy needs or the nation's. Ideally, policies should acknowledge California's energy endgame, that we have to have available, affordable, and reliable energy to sustain growth. A sensible energy policy, here and nationally, should provide broader access to the resources we have so they can be developed safely, responsibly, and efficiently, as we have been doing in our operations south of here in San Joaquin Valley for well over a century. It makes little sense to call for energy security while placing 85% of the U.S. outer continental shelf off limits to exploration, a domain that could possess up to 19 billion barrels of reserves by the government's own estimates. A sensible energy policy must acknowledge and help mitigate the industry's risks. New sources of energy take long lead times and major investments, yet regulatory barriers and permitting processes often make the investment in California very difficult. Despite our preference to expand our business at home, we recently moved a project from California to Mississippi because of the difficulty getting permits. I'm running out of time, am I on? Okay, great. Sensible energy policy recognizes that technology development and breakthroughs will be necessary and create policies that sharply focus on encouraging them. For instance, we're working on a fuels policy with California, the low carbon fuel standard. If we start with low quantities of advanced carbon fuels, we will drive technology development in this area. Technology reviews and milestones will ensure this can be achieved through a measured and sensible approach. If you want to force technology, center policies on doing just that. Let me close with climate change. We know our license to operate is just not about supplying the energy. It has to be done responsibly. And looking ahead, we must add to this complex energy picture how to deal with carbon constraints. We are actively searching for applying these technologies, and we are in the process of planning one of the largest carbon sequestration projects in the world associated with our LNG project Gorgon off of Australia. CCS, carbon sequestration, largely promising, but like biofuels, has one of the many challenges it has is of scale. If we were to sequester all of the carbon from power plants in the U.S., it would require an energy infrastructure equivalent to moving 50 million barrels of oil equivalent around the nation. That's 2.5 times the amount of crude we move today around the nation. Scale, again, amongst other things, is a big challenge. Let me close by saying California and Canada have shown leadership on this issue, but we take a view it can't be solved at the state level. This requires a national framework with national policies, with global participation, and state-by-state action, if it's not harmonized, will cause more cost than necessary to solve this issue. With prices at record highs, there's never been a more urgent time to be realistic about the economic and social costs of the policies we pursue. We're facing big challenges, and the dimensions of energy, environment, and the economy are inextricably linked. The policies that govern them also must be linked going forward. It took humans 125 years to consume the first 1 trillion barrels of oil. It will take us 35 years to consume the next trillion. A simple illustration of the extraordinary challenge ahead. The urgency, in our view, is to be realistic, and this will only happen through dialogue, collaboration, ingenuity, and partnership to make tough but practical decisions that hopefully are also visionary. But we think it can be done, and if it's done in this way, we can turn this challenge into opportunity, and we believe the shared future we all desire demands